So I'm going to give a talk tonight based around a poem that was written by Sangharakshita, who I'll call Bhante because that's kind of how I think of him, really. And this poem was written in 1975. It's called The Four Gifts. And it's related to a series of talks that Bhante gave the following year, in 1976, in the Brighton Pavilion. And those talks were called Buddhism for Today and Tomorrow. So I don't know whether MD in the room, we think maybe Sripada was there, but we're not entirely sure. Where are you? Yeah, you couldn't quite remember, but you might well have been. Yeah, you might well have been.
She was Chan as well, you were Chan.
So these talks, there's a little bit of my own history actually involved there because they were the very first talks I ever heard of Bhante. In fact, the very first night that I visited the Glasgow Buddhist Centre, I heard the second of those talks. They were being played over 4 weeks. And I missed the first one, which I've always thought was rather prescient because it's a method of personal development. And I don't think I ever really got that bit. But I heard the other ones. And actually, the second one is called A Vision of Human Existence. And it just completely blew me away. So these were taped lectures. It was actually a reel-to-reel. Some of you in the room might just be old enough to remember the use of the precursor to all this technology that you've got scattered about here. They used to record all the Bhante's talks, and then we'd listen to them on this reel-to-reel. And then we went up market and got cassettes. And then we got CDs. And then it's all streamed now, isn't it? But anyway, this was a reel-to-reel tape recorder. And I remember sitting there and kind of watching it as well as listening to it. And Bhante had quite a soporific voice, I felt. So I had just been rushing. I'd been at work and I'd kind of come rushing up to hear this talk. And I remember kind of feeling so relaxed that I had to struggle to stay awake, and being slightly hypnotised by this reel-to-reel. Anyway, so they were very important talks to me. They were called Buddhism for Today and Tomorrow, but they've been known within our movement, within our community, as the Brighton Lectures, because they were given in the pavilion. So that's the association with Brighton. But the year before giving these talks, Bhante wrote this poem called The Four Gifts, and they say the same thing as the 4 talks. So what I'm going to do is unpack the poem, but relate it, each of the images from the poem to the equivalent talk. So you get 2 for the price of 1. Get a poem and talks. So I'll start off. The series Buddhism for Today and Tomorrow were subtitled 4 Things the FWBO can offer the world. So in a way it's the same thing, 4 gifts. The 4 gifts that we can offer the world. Oh, because we used to be called the FWBO, in case there's anybody that's been around for less than, 15 years or something? Yeah, exactly 15 years, it was 2010. I'll read the poem. I come to you with 4 gifts. The first gift is a lotus flower. Do you understand? My second gift is a golden net. Can you recognise it? My third gift is a shepherd's round dance. Do your feet know how to dance? My fourth gift is a garden planted in a wilderness. Could you work there? I come to you with 4 gifts. Dare you accept them? So when I came along to the FWBO as it was, I'd come from quite a strong political background. I really wanted to change the world. And I'd still quite like to, but some years later I've discovered it might not be quite as straightforward as I thought it was going to be. But I think for me these talks were the perfect introduction, because in them Bhante makes the point that to change the world you need to change yourself. but that in changing yourself, you're more able to transform the world around you. So they were kind of like the perfect introduction to Buddhism for me. I'd read quite a bit about Buddhism beforehand, but more as a kind of philosophy. I never really thought of it as a series of practices and things that you could actually do. So these talks kind of brought it home to me that in a way there were methods that you could actually use to transform yourself, not just like theoretical. So they were, in a way, I have a lot of gratitude to Bhante for having given those talks, and a lot of gratitude to the centre in Glasgow for playing them. And they were only a year old at that time, so they were quite, it was the guys, I think, that were running the centre. So I think a couple of them had hitchhiked all the way down to Brighton to hear the talks, because that's what we used to do, and others hadn't. So there was quite a kind of air of excitement around them. So he wrote the poem the year before, and he said in an interview about the poem that Sadnandi did with him sometime, like, I can't remember exactly when. He said that he'd wanted to say the same things, but in a more poetic and mythical manner. That he wanted to be symbolic and not just conceptual. So the talks, in a way, were offering the concepts, but he felt that the poem spoke in a different way and spoke to a different part of ourselves. So the poems, like the talks, are looking at how to transform self and world. So let's look at each of these gifts. First of all, just to say they are gifts. So he makes the point that they're gifts. And he wanted to offer something to the world. So the community was very young at that point. It was only 6 or 7 years after the first ordinations. And I think when you come along kind of now to Triratna, it feels like it's been going forever. Actually, it hasn't. It still is quite young. In some ways, in terms of the Buddhist world, we're actually babies, maybe infants. You know, like, in a way, we're still quite a young community. But at that point, we were a very young community. And if you listen back to some of the talks that Bhante gave around them, it's really interesting. You can see the seeds of things that developed later that are kind of like, that seem very present and obvious now. But in a way, he was laying the groundwork, I think. So he'd returned to the UK not that many years before then from India, specifically to form a new Buddhist community. And he wanted it to be an order and not a society. He said on a retreat that I was on with him in 2002, and somebody asked him about founding the movement, he said, "When I founded it, I didn't found it on particular lines, except I was very clear it had to be an order and not a society. It had to be an order in the sense that it had to comprise people who were committed to the Buddha, Dharma and Sangha and who went for refuge. It needed to be a community of practitioners." So that was very much what he was aiming to set up. And he'd seen how Buddhism in the West and Buddhism in the UK was very much a kind of society. You could join it, not necessarily by your practice, but more by a subscription, and kind of call yourself a Buddhist without necessarily having much understanding or depth of practice. So he wanted to shift that. And so the fact that very early he gave this poem or these talks, I think locates them quite strongly in his attempt to found something that was important. So he wanted to share his experience, but he wanted to share it freely. And the fact that it's a gift, you can take it or leave it, really, in a way. You know, a gift is something that's given freely, and if it's useful and helpful, you take it. And if actually you don't think much of it, that's also absolutely fine. You can just leave it. So I think it's important that it was a gift, that there were 4 gifts rather than, 4 rules or even 4 principles or something. Even that, a gift feels quite different. So on to the gifts. So the first is a lotus flower. So there's a lot of associations within Buddhism with lotuses and lotus flowers. It grows in the mud. That's the very first thing to say. A lotus grows in the mud. It grows out of the dirt, and it grows towards the light. And if you've ever seen lotuses, they're absolutely stunning. You know, they've got cousins here, haven't they? You can see in botanical gardens and what have you. But if you see lotuses, I've only seen them in India, particularly. And when you see them kind of like fully opened, and they're slightly risen out of the water. And just the idea, that thought that they start in grubbiness, and yet they rise to be something so beautiful and something so clear and clean. And in a way, that's a very lovely image for the spiritual life. It doesn't really matter where we start. It kind of doesn't matter what baggage we carry, to mix our metaphors. You know, it doesn't really matter whether we start with difficult conditions or whether we start with very beneficial conditions. That the Dharma is applicable and available, and that as we practice, to whatever extent we feel that the Dharma opens us up and helps us to grow, then like the lotus, we can move towards the sun. So I find that a very, very lovely kind of image. And this corresponds to the talk, A Method of Personal Development. So one of the things I realised just before I came along to learn about Buddhism, was that the phrase that I would use now, which I hadn't thought of or heard of at that time, was, if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. And I was definitely part of the problem. I was a peace activist that shouted at people, you know, that kind of like tried to get a message across in ways that were completely incompatible with the aim or the ideal. And I don't think I was alone in that. But I had come to this realisation, through various reasons, that if you don't work on yourself, actually there's not very much you can offer the world. You know, and I wanted to change the world, but I've used this metaphor before, but I couldn't even change my library books in time. It was a mess. So the idea that I was in a state to change the world was obviously not, like, it was just nonsense, really. So I had realised that when I kind of went along. Well, I first of all went to hear these talks, and I was told by a person that's now my very good friend, Damarati, that if I was really serious, I had to meditate. And I was like, oh God, really? It just sounds so boring. And he was like, no, if you really want to change, if you're serious, you have to meditate. So I thought, oh God, but learn to meditate then. But I needed some kind of methodology. And before that, I'd been quite politically involved. I was in the Communist Party, and then I went further left. And kind of like, the theory and the ideals were beautiful, but actually most of the people that I was involved with, including myself, were not that beautiful. You know, we were always falling out with each other, and, you know, quite a lot of backstabbing and kind of competition, and yeah. So I had realised that you really did have to be willing to work upon yourself. So it was interesting that that's the first gift. And without that gift, really, in a way, the other gifts won't be, you can't really activate those other gifts without that first one. However, it's not the end of the story. The method of personal development, it's not an end in itself. So methods of personal development, of course, we think of meditation when we think about that. But there's all sorts of other ways to work upon ourselves, obviously. Study. I mean, there's something very important about really getting to grips with the ideas and the concepts of the Dharma, and really kind of trying to work them out. What do they mean in my personal life? How do I apply them to the life that I'm trying to live? But there's also things like your ethical practice. Our ethical practice is a major method of change. And again, for me, that was quite a big one, really, to sort of start thinking about the fact that your actions have consequences, which, you know, seems obvious when you think about it. But, you know, the culture that I was living in before that was not the main driving force, that your actions had consequences. In fact, you did everything you could to avoid any consequences of your actions. And service, I think you could add as a method of personal development. And I think particularly as one gets more involved in something like this as a community, to find ways to actually help, I think really is a way of working on ourselves, because of course it moves us out of being more self-referential. So you could even say it's a kind of insight practice to serve, because it does change our orientation. And of course, famous within the Triratna world, friendship is a major method of personal development. And I think there's something quite radical in that idea that friendship isn't just to support our worst habits, but actually to help us move towards better habits. I found that quite radical when I first came along. And I wanted to say something about meditation, particularly about the two basic practices that we teach, mindfulness and metta. Because if you take those two practices together as a way of working on ourselves, as a method of personal development, they're utterly radical. They really are game changers. I think particularly if you think of them both together. So when I first started to meditate, I really liked the metta bhavana. I couldn't handle the mindfulness breathing, partly because my mind was so busy that it was torturous to try and actually just sit and do nothing except breathe and follow the breath. It was like, you must be kidding me. There must be something else to do. And I really struggled with it. I also struggled with it because I didn't have a very positive, I had not a very positive background physically, quite an abusive background. So when I started to do the mindfulness of breathing, I just got in touch with things that I'd rather not be in touch with. I really didn't like it. And then the metta, on the other hand, I found it very fulfilling because I could get the point of it. And there was something to do in it, which isn't quite the point, but it was an easier kind of practice to get a sense of. And metta's amazing when you think about it, particularly when you move into the later stages of the practice. Can I take it that everybody's familiar with the metta bhavana, or is there anybody that's not familiar with it? Great. Yeah. Well, it's a practice. Metta means loving kindness. And the point of the practice, in a way, is to develop this sense of solidarity and care and respect and love. But you do it in stages. And the first one's towards yourself, which can be a big challenge. And then the next one's towards a good friend, which is, in a way, probably the easiest one. Although my experience is when you do it, sometimes people shift out of the good friend stage and you find them in other stages. But that's a byproduct. And then the third stage, you choose somebody that you don't have much feeling towards, neither like nor dislike. And you try and really get in touch with the fact this is a human being, this is somebody worthy of care and respect, even if I don't know them. And then the really lovely stage is the fourth stage, where you can guess, you choose somebody you don't get on with, maybe you're having difficulty with or whatever. And you're trying to kind of go beyond that like and dislike and just think, okay, again, this is a human being, this is a person worthy of my concern and respect. When you think about that, that is so radical. There's a talk of Bhante's called Buddhism, World Peace and Nuclear War, and in that he gave in the 70s. And in that he says, if we could just get world leaders to practice the metta bhavana, actually we would maybe move back from the brink of nuclear war, which is like what he's talking about in that talk. But I think that's true. I think if we really could get can you imagine if certain world leaders, who shall remain nameless, were to actually practice loving kindness towards their enemies? The world would change. Anyway, so it's quite an amazing practice, and it's not just to do with kind of being nice to people or liking people, because the beauty of it, in a way, is you don't even have to like them. You're still going beyond that and actually feeling some sense of care beyond the kind of likes and dislikes. I'm wondering if I've got time to tell you about a dream I once had. Well, it wasn't a dream. Yeah, it was a kind of wake, when you're half awake. I'll be very quick. So this is going back to the 80s, right? And there was Nicaragua, where there was basically, the Contras had moved in and the Sandinistas were... So it depends how you looked at it. I saw the Sandinistas as freedom fighters and the Contras the oppressors. Anyway, in this dream, I was singing songs to the souls of the dying, as you do. And I was above Nicaragua and there was a battle going on and there were kind of spirits rising as people died. And I was stopping them and saying, which side are you on? And if they were Sandinistas, I would sing to them. And if they were not, I was like, sorry. And I woke up and I was really shocked because I thought, my God, my Metabhavana practice has really not gone very deep. You know, I'm still so based in... and it could be, I still felt that in a sense I could analyse that situation and have an opinion about it, but the opinion wasn't to demonise the people that were holding a different opinion, or even if, I thought they were outrageous or whatever, or they should get the heck out of there. In a way, that wasn't what metta was about, and it was quite a big realisation for me. I'd love to say that ever since that moment I have felt nothing but metta for people that I disagree with, but I can't. But it's a way to live our lives without creating more hatred or violence, which in itself is a big, it would be a great thing really to do, wouldn't it? And it's a way of orienting our life towards a particular way of being with people, whoever we come in contact with. Whatever their background is, whatever their opinions are, whatever whoever they are. And in a way, through both those practices, we're really trying to help other people as well as ourselves to find true and real happiness, because that's what comes when we stop living in that polarised and biased way. So the lotus, I think, has all of that within it. All of those kind of associations. But another association, before I move on to the next gift, is an association of where we got an Avalokiteshvara in here? Mm-hmm. No. The Bodhisattva of compassion, Avalokiteshvara. So Bodhisattvas can be seen in different ways, and one way of seeing them is that they hold archetypal symbolism, and you could say they represent the awakened mind in its different aspects. So there's a figure called Avalokiteshvara, and he represents compassion, pure compassion, and in his hand, he's got hands at his heart, and he holds a jewel, and that is symbolising the jewel within the lotus. So the hands represent the lotus. So if you've come across the mantra Om Mani Padme Hum, it means Om, the jewel in the lotus. Hum. And that is such a gorgeous image, because what it's saying really is that jewel is our potential. It's our higher being, if you like, but it's our potential towards growth and awakening. But it's held within that lotus. So that can also grow out of the mud, grow out of whatever the conditions are. And part of the beauty for me of a Buddhist practice is to be able to see that jewel in myself, but also to see that in others, and to really kind of get a sense that partly what we're doing in practice in a community is helping each other to uncover the jewel that's in the heart of each of us. And it's brilliant and it's shining. So that's one of the gifts. That's the first gift that we've been given. And then Bhante says, do you understand? So I guess what he's asking there is, do we really get the point of the spiritual life? That this is a particular way to see the spiritual life. And it's interesting because it's a method of personal development, but it kind of opens up to something way beyond that. So it's not personal development in just becoming a better person, which is not a bad thing, but it's kind of got a broader, wider, bigger perspective than that. Okay, I better move on, because that was only the first gift. And there's 3 more to go. I'll probably say less about them. I like the lotus. Oh, one little last thing is my tradition mentioned that I've ordained quite a few people. And one of the things when you're privately ordaining somebody, part of that is you think of their name. And I always think of that as trying to see their jewel within their lotus. But trying to see both, because you're trying to see who they are and what they've grown from, and kind of what it is that's made them who they are, which in a way is their lotus. But also that jewel, which is sometimes not so obvious. You really try to get a sense of that and really kind of trying to uncover something. So sometimes some people's names can come as a bit of a surprise to them. And sometimes you hear it and go, oh yeah, right, yeah, that sounds about right. So I think most of the people that I've ordained like their names. There's a couple of them in the room, so they can tell me after. Okay, so the second gift is a golden net, and the question is, can you recognise it? So I'm going to start this time with a talk that corresponds to that, and that's a vision of human existence. So in a way, this is all about the law of conditionality. It's all about paticca samuppada, which is the law that everything arises in dependence from conditions, and with the changing or the cessation of those conditions, the phenomenon itself changes and ceases to be as the conditions play themselves out, as it were. So the net, the golden net, is this vision. And it's, I want to talk about that in terms of the Vision Festival, and then I'll say a bit about the net and why that's such a lovely image. So in the talk, A Vision of Human Existence, Bhante talks about wrong view and right view. And what he's talking about is the fact that as human beings, according to the Buddha, the way we see the world is a bit off, it's skewed, it's not accurate, it's not in line with reality. And right view would take us more in line with reality. So to explain that, I'm going to talk about the 3 lakshanas, or the 3 marks of conditioned existence. So the Buddha taught that everything that arises in the conditioned world, whether it's the smallest atom or the biggest galaxy, and that includes you and me, human beings, everything that grows and arises in dependence from conditions, and every conditioned phenomenon shares 3 characteristics. One of them is that it's impermanent, one is that it's insubstantial, and the other one is that it's a cause of suffering. So I'm going to explain a little bit about each of them. The impermanence is kind of obvious and quite easy to get a hold of. And as one gets older, may I say, it becomes more obvious. You look in the mirror and there's your mother looking back at you. What's happened? Where did I go? I actually hear it sometimes. I hear myself saying something and I think, oh my God, I'm channeling my dead mother. But also you see it in the colour changing in your hair. And I know some of you haven't got to that point yet, but you will. Well, I hope you do, because it's a positive thing to get there, because the alternative's not great. Anyway, so, people say to me, oh, how do you feel about getting old? And I'm like, I love it. What's the alternative? I'd rather be getting old than not. Anyway, so impermanence is kind of obvious. We can see that. And the Buddha's saying nothing lasts forever. Everything changes. There's nothing that's unchanging through time. Insubstantiality is a bit harder to kind of get a hold of. What that's saying is that not only is there nothing that lasts forever, but there's no thing that lasts forever. So there's nothing that is unchanging and fixed that goes through time. So I find it quite a useful example. Not everybody does like this example, but if you think about a leaf on a tree, I think it's quite a helpful example. If you think about a leaf, it has a particular nascence. It sort of starts in a particular way. It's probably a bud, and it might be quite closed up, and it might be white, and it might be small, it might be furry, depending on what leaf it is. And then as time passes and the conditions change, it opens. So its shape changes, its colour changes, its texture changes, its smell might change. I was going to say taste, but I've never really tried tasting a leaf, but I assume that might change as well. So all of those things change, and then it moves, time moves on, the leaf changes again. It might go from green to gold. It might go from smooth to crinkly. And then at some point, the conditions are such that the leaf falls from the tree to the ground and becomes part of the conditions for the next year when the sap rises again and another leaf is formed. So if you think about that example, in that leaf there are various attributes. There's colour, shape, weight, smell, etc. But what the insubstantiality truth is saying, that there's nothing other than those conditions coming together. There is nothing other than the colour, the shape, the form, the weight, etc. In philosophical terms, there's no essence, there's only attributes. Another way of thinking, a way I think quite helpful, is there's no noun, there's only a verb. There's only the process of becoming. There's leafing, if you like. There's only that sense of something moving through time. There's nothing in it that's like the essence of the leaf around which these other things are kind of hung. And the same thing is true for every phenomenon, including me, including you, including everything really. So over time, everything changes. At the same time, there's continuity, because this me that's speaking to you tonight grew in dependence upon me's that existed before this moment and will be part of the conditions for the future. But it's continually changing, so there's nothing within that. According to the Buddhist's view, there's nothing within that is fixed and unchanging. So this second one is what's known as shunyata. And sometimes you read about shunyata and it says, shunyata means emptiness. You think, what? And it's like it can sound very nihilistic and it can sound like a great big nothing. But actually what it's saying is it's everything. But it's just that there's no thing within it that is completely fixed. One of the Japanese, and I can never remember if it was Hakuin or Shinra, somebody, I think it was Hakuin, says, shunyata means that everything is alive, because everything within that is moving, changing, and in process. So it's very liberating. So you're sitting there thinking about, what about the third lakshana? You're thinking, what about dukkha, suffering? Well, we suffer because we don't live in harmony with those other two. That's what the Buddha taught. He thought if we could really live in harmony with the truth of impermanence, and even in that deeper level with the truth that everything's changing and that there's nothing fixed, that everything is open and empty, then we would be living in harmony with reality and we wouldn't suffer. It doesn't mean you wouldn't get ill or you wouldn't, but we wouldn't add to that by the suffering of trying to make things stay the same. That like shoring up our identity with everything that we like, or pushing away anything that threatens us. So that's where the suffering arises. So they're what's known as the 3 marks of conditioned existence, and wrong view is to believe that that what is really impermanent can give us permanence, and that what is really insubstantial can give us an essence. And we believe that what is really open to change can be fixed and made okay in a certain way. So right view is to be able to live with a knowledge of that on ever deeper levels. And we do know it, don't we? We do have to recognise impermanence in particular. People do things like go away and leave us or die. Things aren't how we'd like them to be. That job that we really thought we might get, we don't get. Or, things happen that are maybe not as we'd like them to be. Things happen, or things that we'd like to happen don't happen. So in a way, learning to kind of live with that doesn't mean that we just go, everything doesn't really matter, because things do matter. But the Buddha taught, and in this talk of a vision of human existence, Bhante talks about relative reality. And of course, that's how we live. So you could say that reality is that everything's changing and that everything's impermanent. Actually, the reality that we live within is that we cling to things. We want things to be better. We want things to, we believe that we exist in a way that the Buddha said we don't particularly exist. So it's not that we don't exist, but that our existence is of a different nature. It's of an impermanent nature and an insubstantial nature. And I didn't mean to go in quite as long about that. But it does seem important. So, it's very sort of, the heart of Buddhism in a way. So this vision of human existence is to show us that we're not separate, which is why it's a net of human existence, and it's a golden net. So it's not just that we see the emptiness of things and we realise that, everything's different from how we thought it was. The kind of other side of that is that we're all absolutely interconnected. It's a vision of interconnectedness. It's a vision that breaks through this sense of separateness, which is what we want, really, in a way, isn't it? We want to be connected. But often the very things that we look for to help us feel connected are the very things that separate us. So to go back to the image, it's a net, it's a network, it's a community. So this is very much, that network of human existence. And another image that you get within that is an image of Indra's net. And you find this in various places, even in the Pali Canon, in very early texts. And it's a beautiful image. It's saying that the whole of existence is interconnected like a net. But in the node of each net, there's a jewel. And each of those jewels reflect all the other jewels. It's a really gorgeous image. And it's showing that we're separate in the sense that we can only really work on ourselves, but that we're completely interconnected because we're all part of this kind of network of life, really, because everything's arising and changing and passing. So to the extent we can really live with that, then we're part of that network. And it's golden, it's beautiful, it's precious. So that whole understanding of interconnectedness is precious. And in a way it takes us into the third gift, which is a shepherd's round dance, which is a really weird image. And when Bhante's asked about it, he says, I don't really know why. He says, it just came to him, but he doesn't really know whether there's such a thing. But the point is it's a dance. And I think we can ignore the shepherds, so to speak, because it could be, he says it could be a fisherman's round dance or, whatever you like, really. But it's basically, the question is, do your feet know how to dance? So, leaving aside whether it's shepherds or not, this image is an image of the spiritual community. And it comes very much in relation with those other two images, if you like. Because the first one of the lotus is our personal development. But then we get the fact that even though we personally have to work upon ourselves, you can't really change anybody else. Don't know if you've realised that. Because we try. When I worked as a therapist, you'd spend the first couple of sessions listening to everything about everybody else in the person's life. And at some point you have to say, yeah, but what about you? I've heard about this and that and the next thing. And really, at the end of the day, you can't change anybody else. You can only really change yourself. And then that has an effect. But you can't make somebody else be different. Horrible though that is. Because, of course, we'd like to, wouldn't we? There's some people I'd really like to change. Anyway, so the fact that we recognise our interconnectedness brings us into this idea of a dance together, a dance where everything's rising and passing, and we're all part of that. I mean, it sounds a bit cheesy, but you could think of us as part of a kind of dance of life, that everything is kind of interconnected. So this correlates to the talk called The Nucleus of a New Society, which is talking about the spiritual community. So the fact that it asks, do your feet know how to dance? It's not saying like, do you know how to dance? It's like, have you really taken this in so that you're able to participate? And, you know, if any of you do dance and you've learned specific, you know, dance steps, there's a point where you don't have to think about them anymore. They just become, you know, there's that point where you don't know them at all. And then there's a point where you know them, but you're awkward because you try to remember them. And then there's a point where you don't have to think like that anymore, and actually you're just able to do it. And so I think what that's saying is, if we can find a spiritual community that we can feel at home within, then we don't have to be thinking about it in quite that sort of way. We can actually just enjoy the dance, as it were. In the talk, Bhante says, talking about the FWBO, he says, it offers itself not as an organisation, but a spiritual community, a community of individuals committed to personal practice by themselves and in association with others. And it offers itself as an open community. That is to say, a community willing to welcome into spiritual fellowship all those who want to grow, all those who want to develop. So I find that deeply inspiring. And in many other places, Bhante talks about that, how as a community, we're not open to just this person or that person, but really genuinely trying to keep our doors open to anybody that's interested and wants to come along. So this dance, the round dance, is an image of spiritual community, practicing together, understanding and recognising the network of connections, and then able to kind of come together to create spiritual community. I mean, I love this image because it's so vital and alive as a way of thinking about community, and also it's kind of ever-changing, because the spiritual community changes with every single person that participates. You know, it's a living organism. I often think, you know, Sangha is the term that's translated as spiritual community. And again, I think it's better to think of that as a verb rather than a noun, because we create it. It's not a thing that you kind of come and go, oh, I'm going to join the Sangha. You know, it's not quite like that. We participate to the extent that we're interested, and to the extent that, you know, as people enter, it changes everything. Nothing sort of stays exactly the same. So this dance that's the spiritual community is a dance of arising and passing and changing and reforming. And it's the consciousness of each of the jewels that are within the network of Indra's net. So I think it's important to recognise that forming community is a gift. And it's a gift that each of us can participate in. Just as an aside, it doesn't mean it's easy, because Sangha can often be, the spiritual community can often be the most challenging of the three jewels of Buddhism. Most people who are interested in Buddhism won't have a problem with the Buddha, you know, it's kind of given really. And most people who see themselves as practitioners probably won't have a lot of trouble with the Dharma, you know, the path, the practices. Sangha, on the other hand, can be a bit more challenging because it's people. And let's face it, people are not always like we'd like them to be. So I think, but at the same time, I think when we do get that sense of community, even if it isn't always easy, I think it can be so fulfilling and so absolutely vital. And people often say, don't they, you hear people say, oh, I felt like I'd come home, you know. And another image that I quite like is, I feel like I'm singing from the same hymn sheet. You know, that I've found people that are singing the same song. Now that's a good image because they don't have to sing the same note, because the same note would just be monotonous. You know, so we need all those different notes, and that's another lovely image for spiritual community. And it's like, you know, from the White Lotus Sutra, there's this image of the rain of the Dharma, and it falls on the different plants. But each plant grows according to its nature. And that's a beautiful image as well, you know. So if you're a daisy, don't try and be an oak tree. And if you're an oak tree, don't kid on you're a daisy. You know, we need to grow into our own potential. And the growth might be the same, and the methods might be the same, but how that works, you know, how that looks is not going to be the same. And I think that's quite an important thing for people to realise. If you're trying to be part of a spiritual community, it's maybe not so much here in Brighton, where you've got quite a lot of order members that are, probably fairly different. It could be more diversity in some ways, but, you get people from different backgrounds or whatever. But, some places within Triratna that are very small, and somebody comes along and there's 3 order members and they all seem to be very similar, it's harder to see how you might fit in a way. So I think it's important, if you're really trying to make a bit of a, bring yourself into spiritual community, to get a sense of the breadth of it, get a sense of, different, even if it means maybe going and listening to talks or, getting a sense of the broader community. Oh my God, I've been talking for ages. Okay, let's move on then to the 4th gift, which is a garden in the wilderness. And the question is, could you work there? So this is a strong image. And a wilderness, interestingly, I think wilderness can have quite positive connotations. Going out into the wild and kind of going back to nature and things like that. I think in this it's more to do with the kind of the deserted nature of a wilderness, that it takes a lot of work for things to grow within it. So the idea of a garden within that. So the wilderness in a way is general society, the world, samsara, to use that term. And actually I think the world, maybe wilderness isn't quite the right image, but, there's a lot going on in the world right this minute that is not pleasant. It's not inspiring. It's not where I want to be or put my energy in many ways. So this idea that we're creating a garden within that. So the spiritual community is the nucleus of a new society. That's the dance. But that dance opens up and creates something that's taken out into the world. And so the garden that you're working upon, it's creating flowers, but it's also creating vegetables and things that can nourish within that wilderness. It's hard, I would imagine takes quite a lot to live in a wilderness. I don't know, I live in a concrete jungle. That has its own challenges, but it's easy to find, kind of survival in a way. But in the garden, I think we can think of it as a way to create things that sustain not only us, not only the people working in the garden, but actually can be offered to the world outside the garden, as it were. And the dance is also kind of working together, isn't it? So the talk that this garden relates to is a blueprint for a new world. So we've had a method of personal development, which related to the lotus opening up. We've got the vision of human existence, which relates to that deep understanding of the interconnectedness of all life. Then we've got the dance, which relates to the creation of a nucleus of a new society. These talks were given in the 70s, and the idea of a new society was popular in the 70s. It wasn't peculiar to Bhante or to the FWBO. It was an era of attempting to create utopias. It was, I'm a baby boomer, as I can see a few of you are. And in a way, I've been thinking about this for other reasons recently, that the baby boomer myth, according to that kind of way of looking at things, is the myth of progress. And I think, I used to genuinely believe that by acting in certain ways I would create a new society, and then somehow that new society would give something to the world. And I've kind of come to realise that maybe it's not quite like that. I still think practice is crucial, but I think my understanding of what that might look like has changed over time. So I don't think I'm going to create a new society in quite the way that I used to think I would. And also I think the demographics in the world has changed so much since the 70s that I think all of these things are principles that are interesting to think, what would they look like now? And just a little aside here, next year, in the autumn, Nagabodhi and I are leading a retreat at Adhisthana based on these 4 talks. And what we're hoping to do is think, well, what do they mean now in this world with the situation that we're currently living in? And it's a different world from this. It's 50 years, 50 years on. I still think there's a need for these things, but they might look different. They might not have exactly the same flavour. Because at that time in the 70s, the idea of the nucleus of the new society included things like people living in specific kinds of communities, working in team-based right livelihoods, etc. Now those things might, the demographics are different. How they might work themselves out now might be different. But I still believe that it's important to believe that we can create situations that are better, that alleviate suffering even, that help us and others to find a way to live our lives that's got more value than some of the ways that, are offered, if you like. So in this blueprint for a new world, Bhante talks about this idea of that we don't practice just for our own sake, as it were. So I'll just read you a little bit, it's slightly longer. He says there's two views. There's a view that we must change the system, and that's generally regarded as the secular view. And then there's a view that we must change ourselves, and that's generally regarded as a spiritual view. And he says, personally, I cannot agree with either view. They're not mutually exclusive. In fact, spiritual movements, especially those of Eastern origin, often are expected to only look at the personal development, change yourself. Political movements and kind of more secular movements will think perhaps if you change the world, then everything will be okay. But he's saying, as a spiritual community, we don't share either of these views, but both of them working together. He says, we're certainly concerned with the development of the individual. This is crucial, fundamental, even where the question of transforming the world is concerned. At the same time, we recognise the conditions externally will help or hinder. So, for me, this was one of the reasons why I thought, okay, I could sign up for this, because I'd realised I needed to work on myself, but I didn't want to give up the idea that actually you can change the world. I did want to believe that by transforming oneself, that would have an effect. So, can you work in the garden is the question. And I think the important bit about that is it's to do with participation, and that all of us, even if you've only just walked through the centre door very recently, but you like the feeling of it, and you want to come and get a bit more involved, you're helping to create the garden. It's not a spectator sport, basically, Buddhism. It's important that we see it as something that we can participate in. And again, when I got involved, and some of you in this room got involved around the same time, in the kind of mid-70s, late 70s, it was very obvious that the movement, the whole FWBO, was very unformed. So it was very obvious that you could help form it. But you walk into a place like this, and I don't think it's so obvious to see, it looks like it's all set up. It's not really. There's still things to be done. There's still, there's all sorts of things that people can offer and can help. So there you go. They're the 4 gifts that Bhante gave us, and they're gifts that we can share. So we can think of it in terms of a mythical journey, even. If we start with the last one, we've been into the wilderness looking for gifts and treasures. But if you come back with a jewel and you keep it to yourself, in the mythology, the jewel will turn to sand. It will not remain a jewel. Your net will stop being a net of freedom and become a net that traps. And if we dance only to have a good time, we'll get dizzy. And we'll trip over each other. So our community is set up to help everybody that's part of it, but also to have an effect in the world beyond it. So I come to you with 4 gifts. The first gift is a lotus flower. Do you understand? My second gift is a golden net. Can you recognise it? My third gift is a shepherd's round dance. Do your feet know how to dance? My fourth gift is a garden planted in a wilderness. Could you work there? I come to you with 4 gifts. Dare you accept them? There's a challenge there. I hope that these gifts enrich your lives. They've certainly enriched mine. They continue to enrich mine. And may they help us enrich the lives of all beings. Thank you.